Hi, I'm Mark McClain, CEO and founder of SailPoint, and welcome to the new podcast we're doing, Identity Matters, where I get to talk with security experts, business leaders, and really people who are humble, hungry, and smart. Today we are live from our annual conference, Navigate, here in Orlando. I'm joined by Dmitri Alperovitch, co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator. Dmitri was also a co-founder of CrowdStrike, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, and he has also added author to his resume with his recently released book, World on the Brink, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And with that as a backdrop, let's talk about the state of cybersecurity in 2024. I think we'd all agree that nation-state threats is certainly one of the issues we're talking about, and let's start there. So, Dmitri, little thoughts on the nation-state world we're dealing with today?
Well, I coined this phrase almost 15 years ago now that we don't have a cyber problem. We have a China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea problem. And it's not that all of the attacks we're seeing are coming from those countries, but the majority are. Not just from the nation states themselves, but also from the criminal groups and the ecosystems that have been developed in those countries. Because the reality is those are the countries that are our geopolitical adversaries that wish to do us harm or at a minimum, sort of as a low bar, don't necessarily want to help us. So when there are criminal groups that are operating in those countries, unlike in other places, criminals exist everywhere, in America, in the UK, Europe, etc., they typically get found, they typically get prosecuted. That does not happen in those countries, right? So you have so much badness that's coming out of those places, unfortunately, ranging from espionage, and you have a number of those countries, obviously China leading, that are really stealing everything that's not bolted down, from trade secrets, from intellectual property, and not just stealing it, but giving it to their competitors, to your competitors, I should say, to their domestic industries. They're now becoming behemoths and dominating markets like electric vehicles and batteries and all sorts of technologies. In Russia in particular, you have this criminal ecosystem that's been developed over 24 years where threats like ransomware and extortion attacks are just going through the roof, right? So now, as a company, you not only have to worry about your data being stolen, you have to worry about business continuity, disaster recovery, from lockup of your data, from locking up of your systems, from wiper malwares destroying you. So the threats are just getting more and more dire and sophisticated.
And it sounds awful until we remember, wait, there's a set of good guys on the other side trying to combat the bad guys. All of us, most of the folks I would imagine listening to this are on that side trying to figure out. Let's hope. Yeah, I'm sure the bad guys are listening because they're listening to everything, right? But I think as you think about what does some of these, significant shifts in kind of a cyber approach to warfare, it's always been with us, but it seems like it's escalated, right? And being covered, as you said, by the bad actor nation states. What does that typically look like for our teams on the ground who are trying to protect their enterprise typically, or their organization, whether that's a government entity or a for-profit business?
Yeah. Well, the reality is that everyone's on the front line of this fight, and geopolitical events are affecting everyone. Just one example, when the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the very first attack was not actually a kinetic attack against Ukraine, was not tanks rolling across the border or missiles striking Ukrainian military installations. It was a cyber attack against an American company. Viasat, that was providing satellite terminals to Ukrainians, and the Russians wanted to destroy them, to brick them, so that they could disable Ukrainian communications. And as a result, not only did they brick the terminals in Ukraine, there was actually collateral damage affecting lots of other customers of Viasat and the company itself. So these are the types of things that I think most people don't appreciate, is that even if you're safely here, thinking that this conflict halfway around the world doesn't affect you, it is. And the reality is that, as I'm sure your listeners know, everyone has limited resources, limited budgets, limited number of people, and it's about how do we make do with what we've got in a most efficient manner, because the number of actors is exploding, and this is where automation systems like AI are absolutely essential to help you get the most bang for your buck out of your investments.
You went right where I was going to go. You said, one of the things we got to keep doing is adapting, and as we all know, both the good actors and the bad actors have a new tool in their arsenal, AI, and so as we talk about what kind of things is it doing to, frankly, the bad guys, help them do their job, quote unquote, their job better. But it's also, thankfully, going to, we believe, help all of us trying to defend. Can you talk a little about what you're seeing kind of on both sides of the conflict that's being driven by AI?
Absolutely. And, cyber is such an interesting study. It's a science like others, but unlike many others, you're dealing with a human opponent, right? A sentient human being. And, you can think of other sciences like medical sciences space where someone goes in and has an ambition to solve a particular disease, Alzheimer's or type of cancer. And hopefully one day in our lifetime, they may do that.
I'm rooting for the Alzheimer's thing because I'm getting to the point that's looming.
Yeah, well, a lot of us, may be affected by that. But you're seeing progress being made, and one day you can imagine where this disease is solved and the person, whoever solves it, sort of is retiring, sipping pina coladas, right? Unfortunately for our industry in cybersecurity, that is never going to happen. We're never going to be done because as long as there are bad people out there that wish to do us harm, that wish to make money, and so forth, we're going to be dealing with this issue. And any technology that gets invented either on the defensive side or offensive side just contributes to this cat and mouse game. And unfortunately, AI is one of those. It is going to be absolutely revolutionary, I believe, to the defensive sector. Being able to aggregate so much data, process it, being able to empower people that are on the front lines, defending their networks to be much more efficient, much smarter at their jobs. Absolutely going to be critical. But on the other hand,
of course,
that same technology is going to be incredibly helpful in making the adversaries more productive. And in particular, in the areas of social engineering and stealing of identity systems, as you well know, you're going to have attacks that you're already starting to see using generative AI technologies to craft really good social engineering emails, using deepfakes to do really good voice and even video impersonations of people to try to steal their identities, to use those identities to accomplish their objectives within the network.
Yeah, as we all have talked about offline as well, the days of being able to thwart these things just because any normal security person, much less business person, would say, oh, that's clearly a fake, it's poorly worded, it looks bad, it doesn't look real. The days of being able to defend yourself by just delineating what's clearly bad from good are over, I think. Like, things are going to look as real as possible, right? The emails, the videos, the things. So I think, like you say, we're in an escalating cat and mouse game, as we've often been. And I think it's not surprising that that you would see AI, again, helping both sides. I think as we see, particularly with your heritage at CrowdStrike and what we do in identity at SailPoint, as we knit together more of the security ecosystem and share data points that we're all seeing from our particular lens, that the companies we serve will have a more comprehensive view of what's happening, which I think can only help us fight these things more effectively.
That's absolutely right. And, this is already happening. I mean, there are companies out there that focus on these phishing exercises. I don't even know why we're doing this anymore because everyone is going to fall for it. And the spidey sense that you might have from a misspelling or something doesn't look right, that's gone. Yep. These things are so realistic, and they're leveraging the background that they have on you to make sure it's as targeted as possible. Obviously, this has been used for ad targeting, and it's been used for sales as well, but particularly by the bad guys, this is creating a huge problem. And, I serve on something called the Cybersecurity Review Board, which is a U.S. government-created board created by the President Biden's executive order that's sort of modeled on the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, where we review major incidents in cyberspace. And one of the reviews we've done was in this group called Lapsus, which is a really interesting case study that we wanted to look at because unlike other criminal groups, these were teenagers. And by the way, unlike what I just said about the 4 major threat actors that we face out there, this is the exception to that rule because most of these teenagers are in Western countries, in America, in UK and Brazil, etc. And they're being recruited because they're teenagers, because they can basically hack the legal system as juveniles. They get arrested, they're out the next day, back to their criminal activities, right? And we wanted to look at it because this group and others that are affiliated with it has been incredibly successful in compromising pretty much every major company out there. All the big technology companies are spending hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars on security. These guys are compromising them with no technical skills. They're not creating advanced zero days. They're not creating malware. What they're doing is social engineering. And often over the phone, they'll call up this company. They will say, I'm an employee. I've lost my password. Can you please reset it? And then they bypass two-factor authentication typically because of SIM swapping, where they'll clone a phone number by working with actually traditional organized crime groups like MS-13 gangs that will threaten or bribe people inside telcos to clone your phone number. And once they have that identity, they can VPN in, they can access the resources, and if people are not tracking how those identities are used within the enterprise, you're going to have source code stolen, you have crown jewels stolen, all without any technical skills whatsoever, right? And we wanted to look at that because we said if teenagers can do this with no technical skills against every major company we have in the United States, boy, we have an issue when the major threat actors, nation states, and others figure this out. Now, traditionally, they've been limited because the use of English may not have been as good by the North Koreans or whomever, and being able to call someone up without an accent, triggering some concerns has always been a limiting factor. Well, AI changes all that, right?
Yep.
They don't have to be a perfect English speaker to do this at scale, and this is, I think, the tsunami that's coming.
Yeah, I think that just highlights another direction I wanted to go in our chat, which is every company I know is saying, I'm going to do my best to thwart attacks, but every wise company, I'll call them wise, is acknowledging I won't stop everything. So now we move from the defensive thought to the resiliency thought of, okay, I'm going to do my best to defend myself with all the technology at my disposal, but a few things won't get stopped. So now we move to how are organizations you're working with thinking about this resiliency issue of absorbing at least some things and not having them take our company down in a very bad way or our customers down in a bad way?
Well, I think there are two elements to this. First of all, traditionally we've thought about breaches as someone gets in, someone steals your identity, let's say, and it's sort of game over.
Yep.
Well, it shouldn't be thought of that way because that's actually only step one for an adversary and probably the easiest step that they can take, because you can always, with a well-crafted phishing email or good phone call, social engineering them, you're almost guaranteed to succeed, right? But just because you have someone's identity, as an example, doesn't mean that you've accomplished anything, right? Because you still need to use that identity to get to the resources you need, to steal data, to destroy data, whatever your objective may be as an attacker. And that's actually where the hard stuff is, because that identity may not have enough privileges for you to get what you need, right? You may have stolen it from a low-level employee, and you want the CIO's level privileges, right?
Right.
So you have to figure that out. It's going to take time. It's going to take effort. And if the defenders are watching for the use of those identities, for the use of those assets, and they're fast enough to respond and kick you out, then they don't succeed.
Then they don't
get
what
the
they're
breach
looking
does
for.
not actually happen until something bad occurs. And that speed of action is so essential. And so many of our resources are kind of spent on that first line of defense of how do I stop this from happening in the first place, which you should do, and you should try to stop as much as possible, but know that something is going to get in.
Right.
And have resiliency in your processes, in your systems, in your technologies to identify when bad things are occurring and stop it before it gets to be a real problem, such as your data taken. And the second piece of this is the destructive attacks that are becoming more and more prevalent, both with ransomware and with nation-state-driven destructive attacks. And that's about how do you rebuild quickly, right? And that's one of the things that I think we can learn a lot from the Ukrainians. I spent a lot of time with them over the last couple of years, going to Kiev, talking to them about all aspects of the conflict, including cyber. And what's interesting is that because they've been targeted so much by the Russians, going back to 2014, they have incredible processes. They don't always succeed in defense. Sometimes networks get destroyed, but they can rebuild that network literally within hours.
Wow.
It is incredible because they've got the images ready to go, sometimes new systems to roll in, networks being rebuilt, they've got the backups that are offline so they can be impacted. And I think we can learn a lot from that, and we need to practice that because, boy, if this is the first time you're thinking about how to recover from a destructive attack like this, it's going to take you a long time.
Exactly. No, so many good points in there. I think, like you said, on the one hand, there's a number of, we have the concept of least privilege, right? Like I want to minimize what people have access to. In the worlds of networks and devices and data, we're trying to segment and minimize blast radius by doing minimal things that would help them, that would help our customers make sure they are minimizing what damage can get through. And then, like you said, now finally assume some damage or some breakthrough happens. How do you minimize the damage? I used to say our space and identity, and I know this overlaps with other security domains, it's about answering three questions, right? Who should have access to what? That's kind of a policy question. Who actually has access, which is where you get into either overprivilege or even abused and or taken over privilege. Somebody has access that shouldn't. And this last question is by far the hardest. And are they doing what you expect? right? I think if we even roll back to another story we're both very familiar with, Snowden, right? Like what made that so brutal was he was an actual actor. He wasn't a bad actor with appropriate privileges. What should have been caught and wasn't at that time was he was doing very unusual things, downloading massive amounts of data way out of the normal scope of his job. But as you and I know, what we know about technology, that's a really hard thing to see and stop in real time, right? Like you have to have a lot of sensing data, and this is where I'm hopeful, I think all of us are, that AI will start to help us with sensing and being aware of unusual activity that we just wouldn't have seen with human effort before, right? So I think this idea, I love the way you framed it, right? There's the, keep the bad actors out, have resiliency when they get in, and then be able to recover rapidly and quickly. Great points.
This problem is only getting worse now with NHI, non-human identities, machine accounts, etc. So those identities are proliferating. Most people are not looking at what that service account can do and who has access to it and the sharing that occurs. And particularly in the cloud systems, you're now seeing so many breaches that are leveraging that.
You kind of bridged where I wanted to go next, which is the role that identity is increasingly playing in cybersecurity. And you highlighted another point. Let's hit them all at once, which is, and we're changing the definition of an identity, right? Forever, when we were dealing with humans, one of the advantages of the phishing world today has been that when it appears someone may have been phished, and the technology security team sees that, they can always talk to the live human and say, hey, did you click on this thing? Was that you or was that not you?
Hard to do that with a machine.
Hard to do that with a machine. You can't query the machine to go, did you accidentally do something you weren't supposed to do? I don't know how a machine answers that question. So as we think about sort of the evolving landscape of threat and overlay that with the evolving landscape of this rapid proliferation of identities, which will be everything from machine identities to service accounts, software bots, to even now AI agents, how do you think organizations should be preparing themselves for that explosion as well in the world of landscape of threats?
Well, I think you guys at SailPoint are so well positioned for this because identity really is the root of all issues. And I'll tell you, even at CrowdStrike, you think of a CrowdStrike as an endpoint solution. One of the things we focus on is how do we detect password theft, credential theft, because that's what every single adversary has to do in order to succeed. So with insiders, with malicious actors that have stolen credentials, it's so important to track what they're accessing, as you said, where they're going with this. And now the problem is just, as I mentioned, it's just getting so much bigger with cloud systems, cloud accounts, so much sharing that goes on.
Right.
You typically today don't share your credentials, your real credentials with others. Some people do, violation of policies, but it's pretty rare, right? But service accounts get accessed by so many people. Sometimes the passwords and other credentials for them are hard-coded in software. It gets posted to GitHub, right? It's all out there. And it just makes it so easy for adversaries to leverage that. Just the simplification of the attack methods are incredible because, wait a second, I don't need to scan this network for vulnerabilities. I don't need to find some 0-day in some piece of software. The credentials are right there. I just use them and log in, right? Anyone can do it. And that's what you're seeing, like these kids, 13, 14-year-olds are able to break into some of the biggest companies on the planet.
Yes, the thought of being outsmarted by a teenager isn't foreign to those of us that have parented teenagers. You just hope they're not so nefarious that they're trying to break into important systems as they do that. Well, I guess as we begin to wrap this up a little, again, you've kind of had this broader lens. I know you started as a deep technology guy into understanding that world of threat, and now you're looking at that broader world landscape. I think you've referred to it as kind of the new Cold War or something to that effect. Kind of as we look forward, and we know that predictions are dangerous in the world we live in. You had a great quote, I think it was from Jeff Bezos, was it? Or about predicting the future?
Niels Bohr.
Niels Bohr, that's what it was.
Used to say that predictions are hard, especially about the future.
And so you said something in our talk earlier today with Bezos saying, I don't want to know what's changing, I just want to know what's not changing about the future. Then I can kind of plan around the stability that I understand.
Right.
I think as we look forward, again, even a few years, I won't even ask you to look out 5. You and I probably agree. 5 in our space is kind of hard. A couple, though, we can sort of see around the bend a bit. What do you think are the things that we'll be talking about, just say 2 to 3 years from now, in the realm of identity and security?
Well, again, I think as with anything, geopolitics is going to drive this, and I don't see on a geopolitical landscape things getting any better. You're seeing this war in Ukraine really changing the entire landscape in terms of not just what Russia is doing and becoming more and more adversarial towards the West, but the alignment that you're seeing across all 4 major adversaries, North Korea, China, Iran. And unfortunately, they're becoming more brazen, both in the physical world, where China is literally orchestrating assassinations. So if they're willing to do that, just think about what are they willing to do in cyber, and how they're going to be deterred from doing that. So unfortunately, the first 20, the last 20 years, I should say, have been mostly about theft of data. I think we're getting past that. That will still be an issue, but it's much more about disruption of operations, causing pain. And, one attack group, I should say, to keep an eye on is Volt Typhoon, which is attributed to the U.S. government, to Chinese nation-state actors. And what they are doing literally has the hair of our top U.S. government officials on fire, because what they're doing is breaking into networks that have nothing valuable to really steal from. It's our critical infrastructure companies, it's small municipalities and water utilities and electric utilities, some of our financial sector companies, but they're not stealing. They're just getting in, stealing identities, establishing persistence, and they believe it's done for the purpose of actually trying to destroy those networks in case of a conflict between the United States and China. That's what I write about it in the book, in World on the Brink. The threat of conflict is going to drive everything, not just in the physical domain, but in cyber domain. And our resiliency as a nation across many of these industries is really, really terrible. We're not prepared for it.
Yeah, fragile in ways that aren't probably fully understood. Yeah, a metaphor we've used for a long time about how the attackers have shifted, and I'll now extend the metaphor, but based on what you've said, I used to say, look, in the early days of cyber attacks, there was a stealing of something, as you said, right? And the metaphor then, I think, was kind of break the glass of the jewelry store, grab the jewels in the front window, and run. Over time, the crooks, the bad guys, the bad actors, got to the point of thinking, well, actually, if I can sneak in the back of the jewelry store and pose as an employee for a while, then I can hang out and case the joint, as they used to say in the old movies, really understand what's happening. And on some very bad night, when everyone goes home, I clean out the jewelry store. Your metaphor would take us to maybe they're just going to try to get into the back of the jewelry store and plant a bomb that they can remotely detonate at some point and just blow up the jewelry store, which is a completely different kind of attack.
Or take over the security room and watch the cameras and take over your network, as we're seeing these days. Yeah, no, I think, like you say, the truth is, as you pointed out in our talk on stage earlier with Rex, our CISO, your point is that the good news, bad news of being in the security industries, we will never run out of things to do. The problems will never be solved. A lot of job security.
A lot of job security, and the escalation has to continue on the good guys' side to combat the escalation on the bad guys' side.
Yeah.
So how we leverage AI, how we think about the attack vectors, how we make sure we're resilient as it gets from human to non-human identities. These are all great challenges to be working on, but it certainly does keep you focused on how important what we're doing is.
And there are some good things that are happening. Migration to the cloud is making things a little bit simpler, automation, etc. But it's also making things more complex as we're creating these NHI identities and other things. So everyone has to keep up, and unfortunately, if you stay behind, you get more and more attacked, because the reality is, adversaries also make a cost-benefit analysis. Yes, there are some targets they'll go after no matter how hard they are, because they're so strategic. But others, if you're trying to cause disruption, you're going to pick the easiest out there, right? And watching what the Russians have been doing against Ukraine in cyber was really interesting, because at some point, the scale of attacks that they were being ordered to execute was so high that they couldn't actually go after hard targets, and they started picking off anyone that they could just find credentials to or vulnerabilities out there, and they were going after toy stores and other things that was just hanging out on the internet just to cause damage, just to meet some metric that they were ordered by their boss to do. So the reality is, we've had this adage in cybersecurity for a very long time. You don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the guy right next to you. And for a long time, I believe that it's not true with nation states, because if the bear really wants you, it doesn't matter who else is running. But because of the scale of the activity that they're conducting, it actually is still helpful, because the bear can't possibly get everyone. Yeah, fair point. Well, listen, let's shift. One of the things I love to do with my guests, Dmitri, is get them a little out of their day job, as it were, and ask them two fun questions. One's kind of a leadership question, one's an intellectual growth question. Either what are you currently reading, or what have you read in recent years, besides your own book that, of course, is fantastic? What have you been reading that's had an influence on your thinking? Well, a good friend of mine, a Cold War historian, Sergei Radchenko, Johns Hopkins professor, wrote an amazing book that came out just after mine called To Run the World, the Kremlin's fight for power, and it's really rewriting of the entire history of the first Cold War. He's got access to documents that were recently declassified by the Soviets, by the Russians of the Soviet times, that are changing our perspective of what they were thinking. What we know our side, of course, in the Cold War, but it's rewriting the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, many other things. Really fascinating.
Fascinating. Okay, great one. And then you're not as old as me, but you're not a young guy anymore.
Not anymore.
What would you tell your younger self if you could give yourself a good piece of advice, say in your early 20s, about life and careers or anything else? Honestly, just wide open. What would you tell your younger self?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time with college kids these days, giving them career advice. I have an institute I founded at Johns Hopkins University on cybersecurity studies, and what I tell them is find something that you're really passionate and good at, because you can be passionate about certain things, but you're terrible at it.
That's right.
Make sure that those two are combined, and become the world's best expert at it. And there's, particularly in cybersecurity, but many other fields, the domain is so broad that there's always something that not enough people are paying attention to. And if you become the world's best expert at it, if you focus on building open source technologies or doing public research and blogs and social media about it, you won't actually have to look for a job. Companies like SailPoint will go after you, will find you and recruit you. And that's how you can become not just an expert, but have an amazing career. It's something that worked well for me going back to the early days of my career, and think it's even easier to do now because the field has become so broad.
That's fantastic. Yeah, funny. My slightly amended but not much advice to that when I talk to younger people, say, yes, absolutely, you should pursue your passion, but please make sure your passion pays the bills.
That's right. That's right.
So,
that's right.
Like, if at all possible, pursue something and have hobbies if you desire things that won't pay the bills, like music and sports and other kinds of wonderful activities. Some people do get to pay their bills with those things, but many of us, those become avocations, and our vocations have to be something that pays the bills. But your point of passion and expertise is right on. So good. Well, listen, I would like to thank Dmitri for joining us today. It's been a wonderful conversation. We've been just had a great pleasure being here with a couple thousand of our closest friends here at Navigate in Orlando, and grateful to Dmitri for both speaking at our conference and joining us here for the podcast today. So tune in next time. I'm sure we'll have another great guest on Identity Matters. Thanks for joining us.